Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the C4DTI Digital Trade Conference and Awards event for 2023. My name is Chris Southworth. I'm the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce here in the UK and also the co-chair of the Legal Reform Advisory Board at the ICC Digital Standards Initiative in Singapore. I'm delighted to welcome you to a fantastic 3 days of content. We're really here for one simple reason. 100 years ago, the ICC was set up to put in place the frameworks for international trade. In today's world, we are doing exactly the same in the context of the digital economy. So this is about getting in place the right processes, systems, frameworks, legal, technical, and standards to ensure that the trading system is fit for purpose for the next 100 years. This week, I hope we will give you all a sense of what is going on in this space. We've come a terrifically long way in the last 2 to 3 years, and an awful lot is happening on a very practical level now that companies and governments are starting to put into place new systems and test those systems, and hopefully throughout the week, throughout the sessions, you can get access to the actual experts undertaking this work and get a sense of the opportunities, the practical challenges that we're facing, but also some of the best practice solutions that we are now starting to see emerge, and importantly, the lessons learned from all of this exercise overall. Just a word or two, a little bit about the Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation. It is a global initiative based in the northeast of England. It was launched exactly 1 year ago at this conference. It's a public-private partnership between industry, the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, and the UK government. And it really provides a convening forum in order to bring together all the actors in trade across public and private sectors to accelerate the digitalization of UK trade. And specifically ensuring that we have an interoperable system that can talk and connect to everybody else in the world. So that's about connecting processes, platforms, and systems. It's about making sure that our borders are paperless and interoperable, and also pushing out through trade corridors, connecting to other countries and aligning what we're doing here in the UK with other parts of the world. The C4DTI isn't the only public-private partnership. There are quite a number now emerging in different countries. There's Paris Europlace in France. There's the Digitalization Working Group and Task Force in Germany, the same in the Netherlands, and also in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So we are far from alone. There's an ecosystem building where we're all beginning to talk to each other, coordinate efforts, and importantly, implement the frameworks that the ICC Digital Standards Initiative is starting to put into place. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the first session. So just before we start the first session, can I just thank our sponsors, Arkit, Inigio, Mercor, CargoX, PargoNext, and Ubersecure, and also our supporters, Global Trade Review, Trade Finance Global, the Smart Ports Alliance, the FIT Alliance, and also all the ICC teams around the world who've been incredibly supportive, promoting access to the event. We've set up 3 days, 2 virtual days, 1 physical day. We're trying to be as inclusive as we possibly can, giving everybody as much access to the knowledge and expertise that you're going to hear this week around the world. This is a collaborative effort. This is not a competition. It's about all of us working together with a common cause to digitalize and modernize the world trading system. So we have a chat room and we have Q&A. Please do post your questions and answers in the Q&A section. Please do use the chat room to share knowledge and insights. If you're aware of papers or documents or frameworks or useful pieces of information, please do share those with everybody. The team will be there to support as well. And for those of you on social media, the hashtag is #C4DTIConf and #C4DTI Awards, which will be tomorrow. So with no further ado, I would like to invite my esteemed panel, which you can see on the screen. Can I invite you all onto the screen? And we will kick off with our first session on the digital trade roadmap. So I have a very high-level panel here. These are the people who are actually right in the vanguard of the conversation. So we have Gerard Hartzink, who's also a chair of the Industry Advisory Board. There are two boards at the Digital Standards Initiative. Gerard is the chair of the Standards Group, the Industry Advisory Board, and I'm the co-chair of the Legal Reform Advisory Board. And those two bodies are talking and coordinating efforts on legal reform and also standards. Trudy Hartzenberg and Milot Armour are members of the Legal Reform Advisory Board, and so you'll hear some updates from both of those in a minute. And then we have Professor Laurent Bartel, who's a well-known legal expert working for Cambridge University and Freshfields Brookhouse Derringer as well, and specifically on trade policy. So we're going to have some interesting conversations there around things like trade agreements. So just before I start, I'd just like to just set the scene a little bit. This conference is following on from the DSI Digital Standards Initiative Future Trade Forum in Singapore last week. I'm sure a few of you were there. I was there too. And I think it's important just to acknowledge a few things. We've seen some big announcements, and this gives an idea of the scale and pace that we're moving. First of all, the ICC has set a target to digitalize 60 to 80% of world trade by 2026. That's about putting in place the enabling frameworks, the legal environment and the standards environment to allow the private sector and industry to start connecting platform systems and processes. We've heard two big announcements from two members of the FIT Alliance, the Digital Container Shipping Association and BIMCO. If you haven't seen those are all over social media, but some very ambitious targets to go fully digital in areas like electronic bills of lading. And I'm sure we're going to see more of those kinds of announcements as the months go on. So just a bit of context for this conversation. For those that remember the Digital Trade Roadmap, which was published in 2017, there were 3 pillars of work there that we set out to help everyone understand what needs to be done in order to digitalize the trading system. The first pillar was around legal reform, and specifically to remove barriers to the handling of commercial trade documents in digital form, and to align our legal systems to the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transferable records, the MELITA framework as it's called. Pillar 2 is about standardization. So this is the piece that Gerard is leading on. It is to have a common standards framework so that we're all adopting the same interoperable standards to allow information to move across jurisdictions, processes, and systems. And then the third pillar, which is very much what this week is all about, is implementation and adoption. And that's, of course, where we bring both laws, rules, and standards together and begin to implement those across public and private sectors. And just to be clear, the legal framework is MELITA. The rules framework is the ICC ICC uniform rules on digital trade transactions. Those are the guardrails for business. And thirdly, the WTO ICC standards toolkit, which is the standards framework. So we now have 3 clear frameworks and actually have a bunch of tools underneath both of those, whether it's a MELITA tracker or data harmonization templates and thought leadership papers on things like trusted technologies. There will be a lot more of that source of information coming from the DSI over time to help give everybody the right tools to get on with the job. So I'm going to leap in and just allow everybody to say a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. Gerard, could I come to you first, and then we'll go around the panel.
Okay. My name is Gerard Hartzink. As Chris mentioned, I'm chairing the ICC DSI Industry Advisory Board. The DSI programs is very much focused on the support of the future digitalization of the international supply chain. Our current board has 26 members, of which 10 are coming from international organizations, global organizations active in the supply chain. Could be physical distribution, could be financial supply chain. We started early 2022. The focus is on B2B and on B2G processes. And currently we are very much focused on data standards because they are very important. What Chris already mentioned, the framework was already published early 2022. It is the ICC World Trade Organization Standard Toolkit for cross-border paperless trade. What we did so far since we started with the board, we created 2 working groups. One working group is called Key Trade Documents and Data Elements. They are focused very much on trade documents. So far, we developed a methodology and we explored 7 trade documents, the content of 7 trade documents. And all those documents do have a general part, who is who, things like that, and a very specific part for that specific trade document. So far, we explored, for instance, the certificate of origin, warehouse receipt, commercial invoice, packing lists, insurance certificate, bill of lading, etc. We realized very much there are about 40 trade documents, but what we did is develop the methodology, explore the first 7, and deliver a report for the market. That report was published last week in Singapore. The report is called Key Trade Documents and Data Elements, Digital Standards Analysis and Recommendation. It is free of charge, available on the ICC website, and after my introduction, I will send the email address, the website name to all of you. The second working group is very much focused on trust in trade, and trust is a very complex issue to solve. It is for the physical layer, it is for the financial layer, it is for the information layer, and the trust layer. So who is really the counterparty who is delivering the goods, who has to pay, and that is very complex if in the business-to-business environment at the global level, because the exporter and importer are by definition in more than one jurisdiction. So in that working group, it was explored how can we increase the level of trust, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a data perspective. And the concept made public in the report is about verifiable trust. So computer to computer, it should be able to check if the data you receive indeed is the correct data from the right counterparty. That is the core of the whole story. So I will leave it to that for the introduction. Chris, please.
Thanks very much, Gerard. So we're going to get into some of the topics here. I should say that I'm not going to repeat some of the high-level stuff we've either repeated before or was talked about in Singapore. We're going to dive straight into the issues here. But if you do want to know more about any of the topics or conversations, as Gerard has pointed out there, just please do ask, because we can forward you the links and make sure you've got the same information we have. Trudy, you're right in the thick of the action in Africa. Massively ambitious African Continental Free Trade Agreement, double the size of the EU, to put that in context, and probably double the complexity, if not more. It's incredibly ambitious and very exciting. Can I just hand over to you just to introduce yourself for the audience?
Thank you so much, Chris. Indeed, I'm very pleased to share with you some of the updates on the African Continental Free Trade Area. Colleagues, I'm from the Trade Law Centre Tralluck. We work closely with various stakeholders across the continent, including the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and Tralluck participates in the task force on digital trade. There is indeed very high expectations of what the AFCFT can deliver, and we see significant global interest in this continent-wide free trade area. It's a very comprehensive and ambitious initiative, and integrating unequal partners is always complex and difficult. So, Chris, as you've noted, there is a lot of work to be done still. Colleagues, the legal compact of the African Continental Free Trade Area initially did not include e-commerce or digital trade. Negotiations began in 2015, but in 2020, the state parties and broad stakeholder community agreed to introduce the negotiation of a protocol on e-commerce into the agenda. Stakeholder engagement followed. There is a great deal of interest and expectation about what e-commerce specifically can do to assist small, medium enterprises, and particularly women-led and youth-led enterprises. So in 2022, the scope of this protocol was broadened to a protocol on digital trade. It will be negotiated alongside a protocol on women and youth in trade. And immediately we start to see there are important connections that we will make through these negotiations and, of course, the provisions of those instruments. Important to keep in mind that this legal instrument will always also connect to, for example, the protocol on trade in goods. It is unfortunate, true, that we do not have paperless trading processes on the continent yet. By and large, trade is very much paper-driven, so our customs and border management processes are heavily laden with documents, and many of which are associated with non-tariff barriers, which are particularly pernicious barriers to cross-border trade by small and medium enterprises. So very important to keep in mind that already the protocol on trade in goods in its annexes, which pertain to customs and border management, customs assistance, transit, and other trade facilitation related issues, provide for digitalization. So very important that this is already among the instruments that have been negotiated. The links to trade and services agenda, extremely important to keep in mind as well. And then we have just completed the negotiations on a protocol on competition. So consumer protection, competition issues are already negotiated. So these connections, I think, are extremely important to keep in mind. Where do we stand at the moment? The task force and the Committee on Digital Trade are working to prepare a zero draft. And although this is not in the public domain, we expect absolutely, given what has been the outcome of stakeholder negotiations, that we will see elements of the Melita framework on the agenda for the negotiations. So, for example, we fully expect to see issues such as customs duties, taxes, digital payments, cybersecurity, online consumer protection, digital identities, electronic signatures, authentication, data governance issues, cross-border data flows, data localization, and so on the agenda. We will also see very specific provisions that are important for the development of digital trade across the African continent. So we fully expect that there will be references to capacity building, technical assistance, and perhaps the specific needs of the small, medium enterprise community. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. But where do we stand on the continent when it comes to this broad governance area? And quite interesting, we have at the moment 33 countries that have adopted legal instruments on electronic transactions. 28 have legislation on consumer protection. Many are amending their competition laws, their national competition laws, to include consumer protection. 33 have legislation on data protection, and 39 have legislation on cybersecurity. So the question is, where will we take this agenda? And extremely interesting to situate the broad deliberations within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, in the context of the African states and their FTA ambitions, if you like, their approaches to broader trade governance. It's quite interesting that very, very few participate in the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce in the World Trade Organization. There are a few very enthusiastic participants, Mauritius, Nigeria, and a few others, but there are also others that hold back and say, we have a lot of work to do at home and at regional level, and now at the continental level, and we will prioritize that first. So I think this is quite important to keep in mind. In terms of concluding free trade agreements with global partners, again, some are enthusiastic and some much less so. So there is a great deal of work to be done, both at national level, at the regional economic community level, and then in the context of the AFCFTA. But we do see incremental improvement. So for example, the Southern African Development Community recently adopted an e-certificate of origin. That's good progress, but there is still a great deal to be done. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks, Trudy, and we'll get into a little bit more of the detail. Actually, on the next panel, we'll be talking about alignment, and some of what Trudy's just said there will be covered by Nick Davies in the next session, this important area of aligning frameworks, what's going on in the WTO, the JSI, e-commerce negotiations, what's happening in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and other regions. It's very, very important that the legal frameworks are aligned. So if I can come to Milot, you next. Milot is another member of the Legal Reform Advisory Board from the EBRD, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Milot, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, my name is Milot Alma, and I'm a counsel at the EBRD's legal transition team. We are a team of lawyers, essentially working on legal reform related work in our countries of operation, trying to create investor-friendly sort of and business-friendly environments in the countries and economies where we operate. We operate in about 38 economies. So really our bread and butter, we're lawyers, our bread and butter is legal reform work. We have our areas of expertise, access to finance and fintech being one of them, the one that I had. And we are essentially relatively new, I would say, in the sense of the policy and legal reform work on the let's say digital trade side of things. But at the EBRD as an institution, we have a trade facilitation program from 1999 who's working on trade and trade related issues, especially on the transactional side, to try to facilitate that trade, especially on the cross-border basis. But at the legal transition team, I would say just it's been about 6 months that we've been actively working on putting together a blueprint, and that's the blueprint on digital trade and blueprint on the model law on electronic transferable records, essentially showing the governments a way, or let's say a roadmap as to how to go about transitioning from a paper-based on end-to-end digital trade sort of process. And as part of this study, essentially, because we're stuck and we work on legal reform on a daily basis, we deal with authorities, etc. We know that going into a topic like this, you can't just go with presenting a model law, essentially. So our paper, which is going to be published on the 25th of April this month, really at the outset sets forth a vision of digital trade and why is digital trade possible. We try to put out essentially what are the benefits and what will they be missing out, essentially by standing still and not really joining this digital trade and all the momentum that it's on this topic right now. And the idea is also to essentially contrast and compare between like what a paper-based system now versus what it would look like and what are some of the efficiencies that are to be gained. But again, because we are lawyers, at the end of the day, we really zoom into the legal and regulatory requirements, but we still take a comprehensive view so as to manage the expectations and to try to really show, explore, and identify the building blocks to this transition, to make a successful transition to digital trade and this end-to-end cycle trade. That's done digitally. And again, we try to really highlight some of the key building blocks, and legal and regulatory reform is really one of the key building blocks. And then within it, there are building blocks. So the milliliter being the main one, and this is what we really go and look in our paper into. But we also clarify that this is really, it needs to be supplemented by other bits, especially on the legislation side. And luckily, even for those, we have quite a bit in terms of international best practice, and including other ancestral model laws on e-commerce, but then the latest one also on authentication. We because our geographical span is quite diverse. We really work on Southern and Eastern Mediterranean, for example. In Africa, we work in EU countries, Central Europe. We cover Central Asia, Caucasus. So really, like quite a wide array of countries and jurisdictions to cover. But our paper really tries to set out a framework which we can use to assess, first of all, where these countries are in terms of what do they need to do, what is their level of advancement, of progress with respect to the key building blocks that we have identified, so that we can really know what do we do and what the next steps in those countries are. Again, we work on matters such as e-commerce and with many countries, and our sort of going forward, we will try to really like add Melita to that, to sort of as an aspect of that project, in order to really, at the end of the day, have countries, more than one, ideally 2 or 3 countries, doing some type of pilot at the end of the day, maybe cooperating with our investment teams to the extent that that's possible, to essentially not just do the legal and regulatory framework, but follow that up with some other type of assistance in making trade, actually in developing the use cases. Because the more developed use cases we have, the more we can show in terms of tangible, like this is what happens when you do digital trade, this is what's working. There are use cases right now, but the more we have, the more we can expect from the uptake. But that's it, I guess.
Well, the good news is we're going to hear a whole bunch of what's going on in terms of interoperability pilots throughout the week. So there's going to be quite a number of case studies that we're seeing, both in the trade space and the non-trade space as well. It's quite interesting. There are wider benefits from the Melita framework than just in trade. So that's kind of an interesting space too. If I could point people, when this report comes out, I've had a sneak preview of it. There is a particularly interesting section in there where the EBRD kind of breaks you down into 3 options on Melita. That's the first time I've seen that. So you've almost got sort of a bronze, silver, and gold version. And I think that answers some of the questions we get from governments as to, we're all starting from different points, different capacities, different capabilities. And I think this report will go some way to kind of helping answer some of those questions. You don't have to be, at that gold standard. You can actually start at a much simpler level and still be Melita compliant. So keep an eye out for the report. I think it's coming out in a couple of weeks, Milot, is that right?
25th of April, we're publishing it at yeah.
So Lauren, that's on to you as my final speaker, and then we'll dive into some critical questions. Could you introduce yourself, Lauren?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Well, as Chris said, I've got a couple of hats at least. I teach international law at Cambridge, and I also practice in international law at Freshfields, the law firm. And my specialty is trade, mainly trade agreements. So for me, this is an interesting example of real trade, which the trade agreements sit on top of. But of course, trade agreements are international agreements concluded between states. They are there to facilitate trade between commercial operators. They set the terms which tell governments what they are and are not allowed to do. And of course, it's what governments do that affect what private actors can do. So you've essentially got 3 different levels. And I'm saying all of that by way of introduction to where Melita fits into all of this. And also because I want to, give full credit to Chris and his team at the ICC and others working in this area, because what you can see with an initiative like this, and Melita as well, of course, is that you need to really attack on many different fronts in order to have the changes that you actually need at a legislative level to take place. And that's really the key here, at the legislative level. So Melita is a model law, which is drafted at UNCITRAL, which is an organ of the United Nations, which does things like establishes model laws, and in some cases draft conventions as well, model laws on arbitration, for instance, all sorts of things that are to do with international trade in the real sense, that being between producers and consumers, private actors, importers and exporters, and so on, but not governments as such. UNCITRAL tends to sidestep governments other than by coming up with model laws. And so the model law would need to be adopted by a country. It's a model law. Countries would need to put legislation in place in order to give effect to what the model law says. In the case of Melita, of course, it's recognition of digital electronic transferable records. But there are other ways that you can try to convince governments to do this. And that's really the key issue, right? Is to get governments to adopt legislation. Other ways of doing this is to do this via international treaties, so trade agreements, in the sense that trade lawyers of my sort would call them. There's a bit of a confusion in the terminology, as you've probably gathered by now. Public international trade lawyers talk about trade agreements, private trade lawyers talk about contracts and so on. They are actually quite different things. But trade agreements at the international level, we've got the WTO, obviously, it's on top of everything. We've got free trade agreements, and we've also got a newer type of agreement, which are very specific, called, well, I go by different names, but let's just call them digital economy agreements. And there are initiatives very much encouraged, I think, by the ICC and others to encourage governments to adopt model laws. And I just want to read you out a standard example. I would also give you a sense of how far there is to go. So the cutting edge that we've got is these sorts of provisions. I'm going to read you a very short sentence from one of them, which are, for instance, at the WTO, the JSI Joint Statement Initiative, it's called, horrible jargon, but it's basically designed to be a sort of international agreement at some point when it gets adopted. I can't tell you what the text says, because in this era of transparency, it's a bad example of non-transparency. The latest version of it is hidden from us. But there are also other agreements. So UK Singapore, UK Australia, UK New Zealand, for instance, they all talk about this. On the other hand, the very important UK EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement doesn't say anything about this, because it's too old, just to give you a sense of how new all of this is. And that's only a few years old. So what do they say? Well, the quote is this, and this is as far as it's got, as from the UK Singapore one, but the others are the same. The parties recognize the importance, the parties of countries, right? So the UK and Singapore, in this case, the parties recognize the importance of facilitating the use of electronic transferable records. To this end, each party shall endeavor to establish a legal framework governing electronic transferable records consistent with the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transferable records of 2017. Now, anyone who's ever seen a contract or dealt with one or an international agreement will know that's pretty soft language, right? So endeavor to establish is a good start, but it's not an end point, right? So that just shows, I'd say, that at the international level, at WTO level, free trade agreement level, deeper type level, these are all ways that countries try to, and of course, I don't want to forget Trudy, what Trudy was saying fits into this very neatly as well, because the African Continental Free Trade Area is exactly the same, right? It's a free trade agreement like the others I've mentioned, and it's doing the same sort of thing. And this is an agreement that's been very innovative in many ways, actually, at a world level. And this may well be another area where it actually takes the lead. Because sometimes that can happen. So it's a sort of area where you've got to attack on many fronts, as I said before. The international treaty dimension is one front, but it's not the most important. What's really important is getting countries to adopt legislation. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Thanks very much, Laura. So I've just noticed that there's a question here from Jara. I'm going to come to questions, so please do feel free to ask questions. I'm just going to kick us off with a couple of quick fire. So if I can just ask for answers to be relatively short. I'm conscious that the questions I'm going to ask are not so simple to answer, which is why I'm going to exploit my opportunity with this particular panel. Gerard, you know what's coming in terms of the question. The big question is my standards, your standards, or our standards. What do we do when we're trying to digitalize either a transactional process or work across jurisdiction, and then we get to a country who says, no, you have to adopt my standards? What do we do in that circumstance?
Indeed, those are the very complex issues, because national public agencies do have the tendency to say our standards are the standards. That is true for identity, that's true for authentication, and that poses a challenge for government procurement, because that means that you exclude, in a lot of cases, suppliers outside your own community to deliver goods and services. That is a practical challenge, but it poses also a lot of questions for exporters to the business community globally, and or to governments, to deliver goods and services if they do not comply with the same technical standards. Those include data standards, messaging standards, and also security standards. So I believe that the industry has solved many of those issues business to business, but so far mainly either or, only in the logistical world or in the banking world. SWIFT network is one of them, but also the BIMCO, the GS1 world is one of them. And the reality in the data governance is we should, in the end, for the general issues, adopt the same type of standards. That makes our life easier, business to business and business to government. And it will, in the end, reduce also the cost of technology, because some of the firms supporting exporters, importers, and their service providers, either in the logistical world or in the financial world, make money because multiple standards have to be implemented in their technology. So I believe that based on the history of ICC over 100 years, the focus should also be how do we align the government agencies that they use the same technical standards for cross-border issues, and not only say my standards are the standards. That requires advocacy, but requires also, let's say, inclusion in, for instance, trade agreements where Laurent Bartos was talking about. So the model law like MLETR is great, but it is not enough based on my experience.
Thanks very much, Gerard. I think this comes up a lot. So anyone who's in the practical space, as you'll hear in sessions coming up over the next couple of days, you'll hear a lot of this kind of question is if you're trying to implement and connect systems and processes, it's very difficult when we do have conflicting standards or it has to be a negotiation. And I think the point that Gerard made there is really important, that this is about a dialogue with governments. Not just industry on its own. That's another question I get asked a lot is, can't we just do this as business? And the answer is, I don't think we can, because it's really important that those government systems are interoperating at legal level as well as technical level and standards level. So I think that dialogue between the public and private sectors is really, really important. So I've got three legal experts on the panel, so any one of you can answer this, or I'm going to pick on one of you. Another key question here is, several years ago, we didn't have any MLETR framework. We didn't have anyone aligning legal frameworks. That's not the case today. We've got 7 countries aligned to the MLETR framework. We've got the G7 now moving forward, and we've got also a basket of other countries that are non-G7 also now working actively on legislation, including China. Now, what we're starting to see is a slightly divergent approach, and that's got alarm bells written on it from my perspective. So the question to you is, we've got Holland, Germany, and we've got Japan now picking pieces of the MLETR framework. Actually, sorry, not Germany, because they're actually fixing that problem. Germany's been in this situation for 10 years, where they've had just digitalized transport documents, but not the rest of the MLETR framework. But what we're now seeing in Japan is just picking document by document, rather than going for a comprehensive approach to MLETR. And then we're seeing the same sort of direction it looks like in Holland, in the Netherlands as well. Is that a concern to us? Does it matter whether governments adopt pieces of the MLETR framework, i.e. partial, or should we be pushing for a comprehensive approach? And what's the consequences of a partial patchwork approach to this? Will that deliver or stop us delivering the outcome that we all want to see, which is full digitalization? So Milot, maybe I'll come to you first on that question.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Yes, very interesting one. No, I think as far as the adoption is concerned, ideally, of course, I think having a verbatim adoption somehow, at least close to it as possible, would probably be the neater and sort of more elegant way of doing it in many jurisdictions. However, it's the level of development of these countries, I think, that really sets them apart in a way as to what way do they choose. And I don't think there's a sort of an exact response to this, but I believe that the more sort of tradition, the more use and tried and tested that these instruments are in the country, the more likely it is that they are really going to try and do it in their own way. In my view, as long as the key essentially principles of the Melita are really enshrined, and that they give essentially this functional equivalence, you have the technological neutrality, but also the non-discrimination bit, and it covers the what the electronic transferable records and documents and instruments essentially. I think we're in a good spot. And then of course all the cross-border elements and issues, because we have to keep in mind that Melita doesn't really cover the substantive law. So I think this is where the trick is in many countries, that you will be actually giving the functional equivalence, but what is an electronic, what a transferable, first of all, without the electronic bit, what the transferable document instrument is, Melita cannot really go and do that. It's really the local laws in a certain country that will actually be, at the end of the day, deciding that. So that's why in our paper, just to go back, we really have that in our minds, and we, as essentially first part of the building blocks is, okay, what type of negotiable instruments, documents, what do you have in your jurisdiction? Are they used? And then we see whether there's something needs to be done there, together with giving the equivalent. So essentially, I think as long as the principles are there, I think it should be okay. But then the substantive law is something that we may have to really go in and work with as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Milot. Trudy, do you have any comments on that in terms of an Africa context where you do have terrific diversity? Are we likely to see a variety of approaches to Melita, do you think, or will we see a continent-wide consistent approach? This is actually just as applicable for Europe as it is for Africa, but if we just take Africa as an example, will we have a consistent approach, or do you think countries will want to take their own divergent approaches?
Chris, absolutely. This is a very practical issue we're dealing with at the moment. And I think we will see incremental approaches. We will also see the influence in some contexts, taking guidance from, for example, EU policy statements, documents, and strategies, and then also model law development at the regional economic community level, as we have in the case of the Southern African Development Community. But extremely important to keep in mind that most African countries are busy with the very complex and challenging processes of developing domestic policies, laws, and I want to emphasize institutions. I think this is extremely important to keep in mind. In the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, I think, as Laurent has outlined very clearly, we've got to watch out for best endeavor provisions and binding commitments. I think what we really would like to see is that this is innovative, for example, in the sense of offering technical assistance with time frames, perhaps moving towards common standards or some kind of convergence on key areas of the framework. So I think the flexibilities that we absolutely need, given the enormous diversity on the continent, will certainly assist the process rather than a big push towards common standards at this stage. Thanks, Chris.
That's useful to know. So I'm going to just jump into some of the questions here. There's a good question here from Jawa, which is in the Q&A section there, which is, in addition to legal reform at the legislative level, Laura, I'm going to come to you on this one, if it's okay. What changes do you think are needed at the private contracting level? That's a really interesting question. I've got my own thoughts on that. But Lauren, is there more that we could do at private, what I would call, commercial contract level, underneath this legal framework that we're asking governments to put in place? Is there more that we could do to accelerate digitalization through commercial contracts?
That's a great question. I think it's important, as you were saying before, Chris, to see the limits of what you can do through private contracting. And in fact, Melita itself has limits on what it calls party autonomy, which is essentially legal code for private contracting. And the reason for that is that we're talking about, particularly in this context, I mean, with electronic contracts, generally you have this, but you've got it in a really strong way with Melita. You're talking about documents that themselves have to have legal effect, have to be given legal effect. And you can't do that through a private contract, right? The type of legal effect that bill of lading has, for instance, or promissory note or whatever, all of this depends on a national legal system actually saying that has legal effect. So unfortunately, much as you might want this to be dealt with, through industry standards and so on, there are definite limits to that, because at the end of the day, if you're selling something, you need that thing to be recognized as a legal thing, and that depends on domestic laws at the end of the day.
Okay, interesting question. So I have my own view on this, is that I think we could be using supply chain contracts more effectively, just like we're starting to now see on things like net zero, nature positive. At the end of the day, if you put something into a commercial contract, it will happen inevitably faster than just waiting and asking. So I do think there's an area of opportunity for model clauses. We already have, again, going back to ICC's work over the last 100 years, we have lots of model clauses, but we don't specifically have model clauses yet in this digitalization space. So could we have commercial model law clauses on things like legal entity identifiers and specific standards, the uniform rules on digital trade transactions, those sorts of areas that would help just accelerate the push and drive, particularly down to SMEs, actually, at the smaller side of the global supply chain community. So I think that's a question I'm going to leave with everybody. It's a question that's certainly in my mind. I think there's a great opportunity there to do more in that kind of space. So I'm just going to go to the next question from, I hope I've got your name right, Pranub. Even if we can work on Melita, which may vary from country to country, how can we solve the complex interoperability issue? Well, I hope to some degree some of the conversation has already answered that, because I see Melita as the legal interoperability layer on top of the standards layer and technical and other legal issues, actually, even within wider implementation. So I think interoperability, we shouldn't see Melita as something separate in terms of interoperability. It allows those electronic transferable records, commercial trade documents, to move across jurisdictions in an easy digital way. So I think, Gerard, maybe I come to you for that question. It's a big question, interoperability. I think you've answered it, but is there anything else you'd like to say to the question?
I'm always reluctant to use interoperability, because basically the concept behind is I make my infrastructure, legal environment open to others, but I do not want to change. That is the concept behind interoperability. So the better model would be use the same legal and technical standards and replace the old legal and technical standards by the common agreed legal and technical standards, because then you create really interoperability. That is not always possible, but in many cases in business to business environment, it is possible. Of course, you have to, for the legal stuff, to make a choice. What is the legal system based on the rules you create? Second, for the technical stuff, you should adhere to a technical set of standards, data standard, messaging standard, security standards that are also international. And there are many of those standards already available under the umbrella of ISO, under the umbrella of GS1, etc.
Thank you. And there's two questions from John Taylor and an anonymous attendee, it says here. But they're both actually asking an interesting question around enforceability. Maybe Milot, can I come to you? I think the basic thrust of both are suggesting that we have solutions available, but there is a lack of enforceability or an enforceability framework around the use of interoperability standards and laws. What's your view on that? Should we have more of an enforceable regime, or should we just allow this to evolve?
Yeah, I'd like to. I think it also touches a bit on the other question as to what businesses can do in their day-to-day, and I think they need to just digitalize their own internal processes, even if it's not trade, even their own commercial. How about going and doing a sort of signing electronically something? My biggest, essentially, I would say, nightmare, without wanting to be too dramatic, is that we go and do a law somewhere and it's not used. And we have in many countries laws on electronic signature, laws on all of these e-commerce, e-trade, which are not used. And without them being used, they just end up there, and it never develops. The more they are used, the more they are optimized for the environment where they operate. So essentially, the first one is use them to test the enforceability and to go and push for more enforceability. So I think, and in terms of digital solutions, it's just that it's great that they are out there. Maybe they will not push the enforceability, and maybe they're not fully aligned. They have to follow what's in the law, what's in the letter of the law. But at least it's a push forward to test, and then to go for other changes to actually accommodate what is it that the need is in order to enforce. Because again, cross-border enforcement of let's say decisions, judgments, anything that's coming, rights, it's a complicated web in and of itself, which needs to be dealt with. But again, use it, test it, try it, and it starts with the businesses.
Yeah, I think there's some wise words there. I think this is about getting started on the journey, isn't it? Not necessarily having to start in the same place. And I think that's the same across both legal standards and wider technical work. It's about getting going. This is not an issue that's going away. This is about the transition to a cheaper, faster, simpler way of trading. Just on that note, there's an interesting question from Greg Pradovan there around this point around Incoterms has been in place since I think 1936 and is well established as a rule book for buyers and sellers of goods. But there seems to be a reluctance when you start moving into the digital economy. What is that reluctance? And maybe I could ask Gerard from a sort of standards perspective, and maybe Laurent, Trudy, or Milot from a legal perspective. There's something about moving into the digital economy space that seems to make everyone sort of hesitate, some sort of fear, where there's a need for more reassurance. What is that? Is that something we should be concerned about, or should we be doing things in a different way to allay those fears? Gerard.
I believe that Incoterms are still great for the industry. They are extensively used in all sorts of business-to-business processes. I know that in the working group taking care of trust in trade, there was a concrete recommendation to include even more in the Incoterms, such as the recognition of legal entities, concrete legal entity identifier. Make that also a standard included in the Incoterms. Why? In the end, there are 45 million corporate members of ICC. They do business to business with each other. And it is for them very important to know who is who, second, and who is the parent of the counterparty they are dealing with. And second, what is very important that maybe not all of you are aware of, the Financial Stability Board produced 2 roadmaps and a priority action list. And for cross-border payment, they strongly recommend to include the legal identity identifier, because it makes it easier for business to business, cross-border payments, and also for the reporting to the Financial Intelligence Unit in case there are issues around money laundering, terrorist financing. So that recommendation came out of the working group Trusted Technology Environment.
Thanks very much, Gerard. Does anybody else want to contribute to that answer? This fear of technology. Laura.
I mean, I guess there's the obvious point that Melita, for instance, depends on a trusted technology. I mean, it says it, right? That there needs to be a technology there. It's very technologically neutral, which is fantastic. Much better than some past examples of technology rules which refer to technologies that become outdated, like telex or fax or telegram. So it's great that it's so technologically neutral, but the problem with that is it becomes so wide open that nobody really knows what that could be. So you've got to flesh it out a bit. Now, you might not want to refer to blockchain because maybe that's dead in 3 years, the way things are going. Who knows what the artificial intelligence masters will tell us to adopt soon. But, you know, I think it's a question of education and comforting people and explaining what it actually means.
Thanks very much. I'm just conscious of time as well. We're kind of running out. There's so many questions. I'm going to have a very quick fire question very quickly around. We've got 3 minutes to go. Trudy, I'm going to start with you and work sort of anti-clockwise around my screen at least. Where do you think we'll be in 12 months?
I'm hoping quite far from where we are right now, and certainly from an African perspective, we are putting a lot of effort into the negotiation of this protocol on digital trade. At the same time, we're working very closely with the World Customs Organization. So when we focus on Incoterms, very important to keep in mind their role in terms of moving this agenda ahead and demystifying the complexity and the dynamism which scares so many smaller African countries to move ahead in this direction. The bottom line is that the greatest benefit of the AfCFTA is going to come from trade facilitation. And at the border is where digital trade meets traditional customs and border management, the paper piles of documentation and so on. We've got to get rid of that to make it work, especially for the SMMEs.
Brilliant. Milos, very quickly.
I would like to say military-aligned laws, but the legislative processes take a long time. So I hope more commitments from countries, more sort of information out there for countries, more informed countries across our jurisdictions wherever we work, and hopefully at least a couple of pilot cases from the countries which have already adopted.
Brilliant. Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately. We could speak on for a long time here. Hopefully you've had some sort of insight as to where we are, the kind of things that are happening, and obviously we'll talk a lot more about this through the week, but at least you've had a snapshot. The next panel starts at 12 p.m. UK time. We'll actually pick up very much on this conversation, specifically around this issue of alignment. How do we align governments, businesses, industries, systems and processes? That's the big challenge, or one of the big challenges that we have, and that will be led by Nick Davies. So thank you very much to everybody who's participated. I'm terribly sorry I haven't answered all the questions that came into the Q&A. That's my fault. I'm sorry about that, but we'll try and answer as many questions as we can outside of the sessions. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it useful and look forward to seeing you in 1 hour's time, 12 o'clock UK time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.